Welcome to the Hindu Daily. So I want you to imagine a scenario. You go to a hospital because, without a doubt that your arm is broken. You can feel it, right?
Right, it's an undeniable physical reality to you.
Exactly. But the x-ray machine is broken.
Mm.
And instead of trusting your lived reality, a panel of total strangers looks at you and says, well, unless we can physically measure the break with our own arbitrary tools, we legally just don't believe you.
Which is incredibly frustrating to even think about.
Right. And that is essentially what is happening right now with the Transgender Persons Amendment Bill 2026. We're looking at this massive policy shift affecting a highly vulnerable population, moving away from self-identification into this really rigid landscape of medicalized gatekeeping.
It's a profound reversal of really a decade of established jurisprudence. I mean, if you look back at 2014, the Supreme Court's Nelson judgment established a very simple yet powerful principle, which was that gender identity is self-identified.
Right, that you just know who you are.
Exactly. It was based on the premise that just as any individual declares themselves a man or a woman, transgender persons are the final authority on their own gender. And this wasn't just a casual guideline, It was rooted deeply in the Constitution.
We're talking about fundamental rights here.
Yeah, Article 14, which guarantees equality before the law. Article 15, prohibiting discrimination. Article 19 for freedom of expression, and Article 21, the right to life and personal dignity. The 2019 Act largely supported that framework, but this 2026 amendment fundamentally rewrites those rules.
And I'm really struggling to understand the mechanics of this new rule. Like, under this amendment, a trans individual has to appear before a medical board to prove their gender.
Correct.
And then that board forwards a recommendation to a district magistrate who issues a certificate. But medically speaking, there's no biomarker for gender identity. You can't, draw blood or take an MRI to see how someone experiences their gender. So what exactly is this board measuring?
Well, that is the exact question medical professionals are raising. There is no external biological proof that can determine a deeply held personal experience. And, to make matters worse, these district-level medical boards are often completely non-existent in rural areas.
Oh, wow. So they don't even have the infrastructure.
Right, or they're massively overburdened where they do exist. And because there are no clear scientific criteria for quote-unquote proving gender, health practitioners fear these boards will just fall back on arbitrary, invasive, or outright abusive examinations.
Which is terrifying.
Yeah, there's a very real concern about a return to genital inspections based on outdated methods of assigning sex at birth.
Which, it's just a horrifying violation of bodily autonomy. It's like having to prove your own deeply felt identity, your own name, even to a panel of complete strangers. So I have to ask about the justification here. Why implement this strict gatekeeping if the government's own suggested race of alleged misuse of welfare schemes is, only 0.01%?
Yeah, it's a very small fraction. To view this impartially, the government's stated stance is focused entirely on preventing any potential misuse of state welfare funds.
Okay.
They argue that a certification process ensures resources only reach the intended recipients. However, mental health practitioners point out that the mechanism of this law creates an unprecedented legal trap.
How so?
Well, think about a psychologist or a lawyer or even a supportive parent. The amendment criminalizes what it calls undue influence, with up to 15 years in prison. So, if an extended family has a disagreement over a teenager's gender journey, a therapist providing standard, evidence-based care could theoretically face criminal charges.
Wait, really? Just for providing therapy?
Exactly. Professionals are warning that this is a public mental health emergency in the making.
And the baseline data we have on this population is already devastating.
Right.
We're talking about a community where 99% face social rejection.
Right.
And suicide attempt rates for transgender adolescents are estimated between 13 and 50%. When you force a vulnerable person to walk into a room of government strangers to prove who they are, while simultaneously erasing distinct identities, like collapsing trans men, intersex, and hydra into one monolithic bureaucratic box, you're just pushing people completely out of the formal healthcare system.
Which brings up a critical point about how public policy directly impacts physical and mental survival. The systemic vulnerabilities are huge.
Right. Well, let's actually transition on that note to another systemic vulnerability.
Yeah.
From human rights policy over to our public health infrastructure due to environmental shifts. Because, we usually picture climate change as a polar bear on a melting ice cap.
Yeah, that's the classic image.
But the sources today suggest that our own bodies and the cities you live in have become the actual disaster zones.
The shift in perspective here is vital. Climate change is no longer just an ecological issue. It operates mechanically as a broad-spectrum medical emergency. It takes every disease pathway we already know and acts as an accelerant.
Oh, like a multiplier effect.
Exactly. Look at Mumbai. The increasingly frequent waterlogging isn't just an inconvenience for your commute, right? It is fundamentally overwhelming the sanitation infrastructure. The standing water is actively breeding cholera, typhoid, and leptospirosis in neighborhoods that previously had these totally under control.
So it's literally changing the physical map of where diseases can survive.
Yes, and we're seeing that everywhere. The data shows dengue patterns in Delhi NCR have shifted. Cases historically peaked in September, but now they're peaking in November.
Because it's staying warmer for longer.
Exactly. The warmer, rainier conditions keep the mosquito populations alive for months longer. Malaria is even showing up in cooler, higher altitude zones like Himachal Pradesh now.
Okay, but let me challenge this for a second. We usually think of climate change as melting ice caps, but you're saying our bodies are the disaster zones. Is this strictly a climate change issue, or are we just using the weather as a scapegoat for terrible urban drainage and poor city planning?
It is absolutely a compounding feedback loop, but the climate is the catalyst that breaks the infrastructure. Let's look at the mechanical relationship between heat and air pollution to see how this works inside your body.
Okay.
Hotter summers mean massive spikes in air conditioning usage, right? That AC usage requires more power, generating more greenhouse gases and elevating PM 2.5 pollution. And these microscopic pollutants, particulate matter smaller than 2.5 microns, they don't just irritate your throat.
Right, they go deeper.
They're small enough to cross the lung barrier and enter your bloodstream directly.
I think a lot of people don't realize that. It's not just a cough. It's like pumping microscopic rust right into your blood vessels.
That's a highly accurate way to visualize it. Once in the bloodstream, PM 2.5 causes systemic inflammation. It damages the inner lining of your blood vessels, accelerates atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of the arteries, and directly increases the risk of heart attacks. Chronic exposure also impairs the filtration system in your kidneys. Meanwhile, the greenhouse gases trap more heat. The human body relies on nighttime cooling to repair cellular damage and give the cardiovascular system a rest.
So you need that temperature drop to recover.
Yes, but rising nighttime temperatures in cities like Delhi NCR completely eliminate that recovery window. Your heart is forced to work overtime 247 just to cool you down.
That is genuinely terrifying. And it cascades into what we eat too, right? Because the sources note that heat stress directly reduces cattle milk production.
Right. The agricultural impact is huge.
So you have a drop in local dairy yields, which immediately impacts infant nutrition, creating this hidden secondary crisis of chronic micronutrient deficiencies.
Which perfectly illustrates why we have to stop viewing the environment and the human body as two separate things.
Exactly. And since climate change operates as a massive medical emergency, our response requires an equally massive interconnected framework. Which brings us to the One Health concept. Have you ever seen that 1995 sci-fi film Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman?
Oh, the one featuring the fictional Motaba virus. Yes.
Yeah. It's unsettling how closely that fictional narrative mirrored the real-world mechanics of zoonotic spillover.
It really is, where human encroachment like deforestation and the wildlife trade forces animal pathogens into human populations.
Exactly. And the proposed solution to prevent the next outbreak is One Health, integrating human, animal, and environmental health data. It's like treating the entire forest ecosystem instead of just putting a bandage on one sick tree.
That's a great way to frame it.
The sources trace this movement back to the 2004 Manhattan Principles and the aftermath of the SARS epidemic. And now all eyes are on the WHO Pandemic Agreement scheduled for May 2025, which focuses heavily on something called pathogen access and benefit sharing.
Right.
But I have to be a little skeptical here. These global treaties always sound brilliant on paper in Geneva, but do they actually force reluctant nations to share their genetic data when a crisis hits?
Well, that skepticism is entirely warranted given the history of international diplomacy. However, COVID-19 kind of changed the calculus. It was the ultimate devastating proof of concept.
Because we saw what happens when things fail.
Yes, the global community saw the catastrophic economic and human cost of uncoordinated responses. But mechanically, COVID also proved the power of the One Health model. The moment the genetic sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus was shared globally, it triggered a massive interconnected scientific effort.
which resulted in vaccine development at record speed.
Exactly. Data sharing literally saved millions of lives. And India is actively trying to domesticate this model. The government is fast-tracking the National One Health mission to integrate disease surveillance across human and veterinary sectors.
So it's happening at the national level.
Yes, and we're also seeing fascinating state-led mechanics. Odisha is implementing a dedicated climate budget to track health impacts. And Kerala has a participatory carbon-neutral plan in the village of Meenangadi, proving that you can operationalize this massive concept at the local panchayat level.
But let's be real. Global frameworks and treaties mean absolutely nothing if you don't have robust medical infrastructure on the ground. You need actual hospitals to treat sick people.
Which is absolutely essential, yeah.
Which leads us to the rapid democratization of tertiary healthcare in India. The narrative here is that healthcare excellence is no longer hoarded in the capital. It's being shipped to your doorstep.
And the structural scale-up over the last decade is genuinely unprecedented. Since 2014, the number of MBBS seats has surged from roughly 50,000 to 1,020,000.
Wow, more than double.
And postgraduate seats jumped from 30,000 to 80,000. A major engine of this is the PMSSY, the Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Yojana. With an 11,000 crore rupee budget, this federal scheme has operationalized 22 new AIMS across the country.
22 new ones.
Yeah, and the critical mechanism to understand here is that these are not just satellite clinics. They are legislated as institutes of national importance, mandated to deliver the same tier of clinical care and research as the original AIMS in New Delhi.
Okay, but let me pause you there. Because you can pour concrete and buy expensive MRI machines, right? But can you really just copy-paste an institution's elite culture and surgical quality just by building a new hospital building and slapping the AIMS name on it?
The government actually anticipated that exact problem, which is why they implemented the Mother AIMS model.
How does that work?
It works mechanically through direct mentorship. Senior faculty and administrators from AIMS New Delhi physically travel to the new institutions to help set up surgical departments, design the curriculum, and establish research protocols.
Oh, so there's direct hand-holding.
Exactly. This structured hand-holding culminates in the January 2026 Pan-AIMS Research Consortium, which allows these new hospitals to run joint clinical trials on regional priorities, like specific metabolic disorders or local cancers.
And the economic impact of having that in your backyard has to be massive for the average listener.
It completely alters the macroeconomic reality of millions of families. Historically, seeking specialized care meant traveling to a metro city, paying for lodging, and absorbing catastrophic out-of-pocket costs that often pushed families straight into generational poverty.
Right, the hidden costs of illness.
Yes. Now, you integrate local tertiary care with the Ayushman Bharat PMJAY insurance scheme and the digital health mission. Let's look at the ABHA registrations, the Ayushman Bharat health account. Using the scan and share feature, a patient can just scan a QR code, and their entire medical history is instantly available to the new specialist.
So no more lugging around huge folders of physical files.
Exactly, and it eliminates the need to repeat expensive diagnostic tests. It fundamentally rewires how equitable healthcare is delivered.
But, there's a stark contrast to those shiny new AIMS. While top-tier healthcare is democratizing, grassroots urban health still struggles with foundational issues. And tuberculosis serves as the ultimate diagnostic tool for these systemic urban failures. It's like TB acts like a check engine light for a city's social infrastructure.
That check engine light is flashing red right now. India currently bears 25% of the global TB burden. And to understand why, you have to look at the mechanics of the disease.
Right.
TB isn't just an airborne infection you happen to catch on a bus. The bacteria can sit dormant in your body for years. It actively develops into disease precisely where malnutrition, physically demanding informal labor, and severe overcrowding intersect.
So it's deeply tied to poverty.
Exactly. Exposure is practically universal in many dense cities, but the disease only breaks through when the immune system's vulnerabilities converge.
So my question is, if we have these 22 shiny new AIMS, and we've known exactly how to cure TB with antibiotics for over half a century, why are we still failing to treat a disease we know how to cure? Why can't we just find the patients and dispense the pills?
Because the mechanics of our urban primary care system are deeply fractured. A recent Pathways study of multi-drug-resistant TB in Mumbai tracked the actual journey of patients.
What do they find?
It showed them bouncing endlessly between local pharmacists, informal practitioners, and overcrowded public clinics. They experience deeply fragmented care, getting partial treatments that really only serve to make the bacteria stronger before finally landing on a correct diagnosis.
Wow. And the sources mention migrant populations as a huge barrier, too.
Yes. Think about how healthcare access is built. It almost always assumes a static population, but urban migrant workers frequently change residences depending on where the daily wage work
So
is.
they move around constantly.
Right, and they often lack the permanent address proof required to register for continuous long-term care programs at a single clinic. Health for All fails at the mechanical level when the system is designed exclusively for a stable, documented population.
That makes total sense.
Curing TB requires making healthcare completely portable and integrating disease control directly with basic neighborhood services, like housing and nutrition. TB is essentially a proxy measurement for urban fragility.
Right. Well, let's shift gears entirely. The physical toll of all this systemic fragility really leads us to the internal psychological experience. Like, how does the human brain manage its own identity and boundaries when faced with stress, impermanence, or shifting paradigms?
It's a fascinating area of research.
Yeah, the sources talk about this phenomenon called the overview effect in astronauts and the underview effect in deep-sea explorers, where the actual boundary of me versus the outside world physically softens in their minds.
The softening of the self is one of the most exciting frontiers in modern neuroscience. We are finally mapping philosophical concepts onto biological brain activity.
It's wild.
Take Ramana Maharshi, a 19th century philosopher who constantly asked the inquiry, who am I? Today, laboratories are testing the mechanics of that exact question. In a recent EEG study using the psychedelic compound DMT, researchers mapped what happens to the brain's rhythm. Specifically, they looked at alpha waves.
Okay, can you break down what alpha waves actually do for us on a normal Tuesday?
Sure, think of alpha waves as the conductor of an orchestra. They help maintain a stable, inward-focused model of yourself, ensuring all the different parts of your brain are playing the same tune about who you are.
Keeping everything synchronized.
Yes. The brain normally operates in a delicate state called criticality. It is organized enough to remain coherent, but flexible enough to process new information. Under DMT, the researchers watched those alpha waves dramatically weaken and lose coordination.
So the conductor drops the baton.
Exactly. The brain shifted out of its criticality balance, and the participants reported completely losing their ordinary, rigid sense of self.
It is genuinely fascinating that ancient Eastern philosophy is now being mapped out on modern EEG screens. But I have to push back here.
Sure.
Is this temporary brain chemistry actually useful? Or is it just a fleeting hallucination that fades by the time you log into work on Monday morning?
Well, that is the central debate. Thinkers like Dan Zahavi and Jeff Greenberg argue that the self isn't permanently erased. Instead, the different layers of your identity, your bodily awareness, your personal narrative are temporarily reorganized.
Okay.
The utility of this is profound. Look at a recent study comparing 54 long-term ayahuasca users to 53 non-users. The mechanism of change wasn't that the users suddenly adopted new religious dogma.
Right.
Rather, psychological profiling showed they developed a significantly increased acceptance of impermanence. They built a flexible, emotional stance toward change and mortality without destroying their everyday functioning.
And there was a fascinating MEG study with meditators that looked at how the brain processes death, right?
Yes, using magnetoencephalography to track magnetic signals in the brain. They showed participants death-related cues paired with an image of their own face.
Wow.
In non-meditators, the brain reflexively suppresses the surprise signal. It's an automatic mechanical defense mechanism to block out the reality of your own mortality.
We just don't want to think about it.
Exactly. But experienced meditators, they don't reflexively suppress it. Their neural activity showed they process the existential cue directly. By repeatedly loosening their sense of self during meditation, they trained their brains to encounter the idea of mortality without automatically throwing up a wall of anxiety.
That's incredible. Well, from the cognitive infrastructure of the self, we move to the cognitive infrastructure of learning. How foundational literacy is the absolute prerequisite for grasping new, complex paradigms like AI.
Right.
Because on April 1st, 2026, the CBSE is launching a massive new AI curriculum for classes 3 through 8.
The focus of this rollout is computational thinking, or CT, alongside artificial intelligence. But the mechanical structure of how it's taught is what really matters.
How so?
For classes 3 to 5, the curriculum doesn't just throw kids into raw AI coding. The focus is entirely on CT teaching pattern recognition, problem decomposition, and algorithmic reasoning. And crucially, it's embedded into existing subjects like math and language, not as a standalone subject. Formal AI concepts only enter the picture in class 6.
I understand the ambition, but the reality on the ground is brutally disconnected from this plan. I mean, let's look at the ACER 2024 report. It found that over half of Class 5 students in government schools cannot even read a Class 2 level text.
Which is a staggering deficit.
And the PERIC 2024 survey proved this isn't just a rural issue. Urban private schools are struggling massively, too. It's like trying to teach someone to write complex code when they haven't learned the alphabet yet. Are we just setting up a system where we test kids on their lack of reading skills rather than their actual tech abilities?
That is exactly the systemic failure educators are terrified of. The mechanism of meaningful learning relies on LSRW listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The educational pipeline for this new AI curriculum is going to break quietly.
Break quietly.
Yes. Think about how computational thinking is actually taught in a classroom. The resource books use word puzzles and logic exercises mediated entirely through text. If a child cannot comprehend the basic language of the puzzle, they can't even access the logic problem underneath it.
So they're stuck at step 1.
Right. To that child, the entire CT curriculum just feels like an insurmountable reading barrier.
And what happens when they get to Class 6
Yeah.
and face actual assessments?
The assessments shift toward project presentations, reflective journals, and written rubrics. If the foundational LSRW skills aren't firmly in place, these assessments cease to be tests of computational logic. They merely become tools that measure a child's literacy deficit, making the entire AI push hollow for millions.
Which is tragic. And, this unequal access to education perfectly mirrors the unequal access to information online, where what you were allowed to see depends entirely on who provides your internet.
Yeah, the digital divide.
Under Sections 69A and 79 of the IT Act, ISPs are legally required to block certain sites. And they do this primarily through a mechanism called DNS poisoning.
Right. To understand how this works mechanically, we have to look at the domain name system, or DNS. When you type a website name into your browser, DNS is the system that translates that human-readable name into a numerical IP address so your computer can connect to it. When an ISP uses DNS poisoning, it essentially corrupts that translation process.
Let me try to visualize this. It's like getting into a taxi, giving the driver an exact address, but the driver has been secretly ordered by the taxi company to drop you off at a blank brick wall every time you ask for that specific street.
That is a perfect analogy. The ISP server deliberately returns a false IP address, routing your browser into a dead end. ISPs favor this method because it is mechanically cheap and doesn't require complex, deep packet inspection.
But what is staggering is how inconsistently this is applied. A 2025 study queried the DNS servers of 6 major ISPs, testing over 294 million domains.
A massive sample size.
Huge. And they found over 43,000 blocked domains. But here's the wild part. Only 1,414 of those sites were blocked by all 6 ISPs. So the internet you experience is fundamentally different from the internet your neighbor experiences, just based on who you pay for Wi-Fi.
The data reveals a deeply fragmented digital landscape. I mean, piracy, file sharing, and gambling sites are blocked completely haphazardly. However, the study noted that when it comes to terrorism-related content or highly specific sensitive sites like China's Weibo platform or the Kashmir Walla, there is perfect consensus across all ISPs.
So the big stuff is coordinated?
Yes. It impartially indicates that certain orders are enforced with absolute rigor, while the rest of the internet is left to the arbitrary technical whims of the ISPs.
But wait, if DNS blocking is so basic, if it's just the taxi driver taking you to the wrong place, can't users just easily bypass it by changing their device settings to a public server like Google's?
Technically, yes. Anyone with basic tech literacy can change their DNS settings in about 2 minutes and bypass the block entirely. But that misses the broader systemic issue.
Which is?
The sheer opacity of this blocking regime. The average user has no idea why a site isn't loading. Without a transparent, standardized framework where block domains are publicly disclosed, millions of users are subject to an invisible, wildly inconsistent filter.
Wow. Well, control over information shapes regional identity and history, which leads us directly into the linguistic and historical debate over what to call a state, Kerala or Keralam.
Right.
There is currently a proposal, unanimously supported by all political parties and approved by the union government, to officially change the name to Keralam.
The historical justification for choosing one over the other is actually surprisingly ambiguous. If you look at Herman Gundert's exhaustive 1872 Malayalam dictionary, he defines both terms interchangeably as the land of coconut trees.
Oh, both of them.
Yeah. Culturally, there's the Kerala myth, which credits the warrior sage Parasurama with throwing his axe and carving the land from the sea. However, historical evidence shows that identity in this region was far more fluid than modern borders suggest.
Because in the 18th and 19th centuries, there wasn't a single Kerala, right? It was a collection of native states like Travancore and Cochin.
Exactly. The identity was primarily linguistic. It was about Malayaliness.
Uh,
And interestingly, this identity often solidified as a reaction against external administrative dominance.
like,
In Travancore, for instance, there was significant resentment against Tamil Brahmins who held powerful administrative posts under the British. The identity coalesced around the language rather than strict territorial lines drawn on a map.
honestly, it feels a bit like arguing over Britain versus Britannia.
Mm.
Does an M at the end really change the region's soul? I mean, isn't Kerala used just as much in ancient texts like Ashokan edicts, making this whole debate more about modern politics than historical purity?
You're touching on a crucial mechanism of how regional identity is manufactured. During the Aiki Kerala, or United Kerala movement in the 1940s, both Kerala and Keralam were used freely.
Okay.
Regional identity formation often relies just as much on historical forgetting as it does on historical memory. You choose what to remember. Even English has a deep, complex history in the state's administration. So synthesizing this impartially, modern claims of absolute historical purity ignore the messy, fluid reality of how the state was actually built.
Right. Well, the struggle to accurately define and measure regional identity isn't just happening at the state level. Entire global regions, like the Global South, must define their own metrics for economic survival and energy resilience.
The central tension here is how we define that resilience. If you look at the 2025 Renewables Global Status Report, countries in the Global South, specifically Brazil, China, and India, are absolutely dominating massive non-fossil capacity deployments.
Yielding solar and wind everywhere.
Yes. Yet, despite this green transition, these economies remain acutely vulnerable to external fossil fuel price shocks, driven by geopolitical tensions in West Asia or the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
We keep patting ourselves on the back for installing solar panels, but a conflict in West Asia still wrecks the local economy. It's like adding a huge solar battery to your house, but still relying on a shaky, expensive grid for your most essential appliances.
That's spot on. The data is stark. Countries like Malawi and Gambia saw fuel prices spike by 34 to 35%. And India's crude oil free on board price rose by 50% in March 2026 alone.
Which exposes a critical flaw in how we track climate progress. Because current metrics, like carbon or energy intensity, don't measure vulnerability to imported inflation.
Exactly. The authors propose a new metric, fossil fuel intensity. This measures the total consumption of oil, gas, and coal relative to the country's actual economic output.
Because even with all the green energy, our actual volume of oil use is going up. Despite India's fuel substitution programs like electrification of biofuels, petroleum consumption has risen 40% over the last decade.
Precisely. To accurately measure true resilience, we must evaluate this national fossil fuel intensity. Furthermore, this new metric must mechanically incorporate the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities.
Can you explain that principle for the listener?
Sure. It's the acknowledgement that wealthy nations built their economies by freely burning cheap fossil fuels for over a century. Therefore, developing nations cannot be penalized by the exact same immediate emission standards, normalizing the index levels the playing field.
It's about fairness in the data.
Yes. A comprehensive clean energy metric isn't about competing with the developed world. It's about macroeconomic stability. It is about attracting the massive climate finance required to truly insulate vulnerable populations from imported inflation.
That makes a lot of sense.
And before we wrap up, I'd leave you with this final thought. If we successfully build and enforce this new Global South metric, how might it fundamentally shift the balance of power in global climate negotiations? Will the countries that control the data eventually control the future of climate finance itself?
Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.